Hello, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the first NAGT webinar of fall 2022. NAGT webinar series is your one-stop shop for strengthening work in Earth education. Webinars in this series feature novel and innovative work in Earth education, research, and pedagogy, new teaching materials, and classroom and professional experiences of people just like you. That NAGT webinar series is free and open to the public, and we encourage you to invite your colleagues to attend and join in the discussion. On the screen is a link to the webinar series, and I will also be dropping some of these pages into the chat. You can find the webinar schedule, archive of past events, and information on our sponsoring projects and programs. You can find slides, resources, recordings of each webinar, including today's, through that webinar archive page. So before we get started today, I wanted to just remind everybody to mute and turn off the video. Here are the standard Zoom controls we should all probably be really familiar with by this point. But if you have any questions, feel free to chat me directly. Be sure to put any questions and comments in the chat along the way. There will be a Q&A section later on in the webinar, so where you'll be able to unmute and ask your questions. As a reminder, all NAGT participants are expected to abide by the Code of Conduct, and I know that the committee will be talking a lot more about that in just a minute. Today's webinar is entitled Today's webinar is entitled Community Efforts to Broadening Conference Participation in the Geosciences. And it's going to feature a panel of speakers as well as an introduction from the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee of NAGT. There will be presentations from the panel as well as a Q&A discussion, hopefully with all of you. So thank you for participating in this webinar series, and I'm going to turn it over to the DEI Committee to do the rest of the introductions.
Thank you, John. I'm going to share my screen. And welcome to everybody today. There we go. With discussion with the DEI and other individuals within NAGT, we wanted to hold a session essentially about meeting modality. We've been through a lot of changes in the last 2 or 3 years brought about by COVID and its impact our professional development experiences and opportunities, and also that for our students. There's maybe some pros and cons to the changes that have gone on. It's a lower carbon footprint. If we stay home and do meetings hybrid or online, we can think about the reduced cost. And certainly broadening participation for all people to attend an online meeting, or at least to have that option compared to our traditional face-to-face meetings that we were used to so much before the pandemic and it started. So we'd like to hear from our members today to ask questions or share thoughts, and please offer any constructive suggestions you might have for us as we move forward and as we plan more meetings and conferences. We do have a code of conduct. I'm not going to read all of it. Most of you are familiar with it, but certainly we'll treat each other with respect and consideration today. That would be one of the most important. I know nearly every one of you, and you're very collegial, and I appreciate that. Please open up communication for all of us and keep that going. Of course, we won't tolerate any kind of harassment or verbal abuse or written abuse in the chat box. And so my peers will be keeping an eye on the chat. This is sort of where we're headed today. We have a plan, of course. The introductions will not take a full 10 minutes, so that's good. That'll probably help keep us on schedule a little bit. I do want to introduce my co-committee members. Amy Weisslogel did a lot of our organization to get the webinar moving, and she's going to join us a little bit in the hour. Laura Rodemaker has been the chair of the committee for the last 3 years, and she'll be monitoring the chat. Thank you, Laura. Yadi Ibarra is also part of the group, and Yadi will be watching the chat as well and chiming in from there. Sami Nyarko will join us once he gets out of his faculty meeting. Unika is here too, Unika Knight, and she'll be monitoring the chat. And lastly, our member, Zaran Ali, was not able to attend today. So shortly, I'll introduce our panelists, and they'll have a few minutes to speak and tell us about their experiences and their expertise in running a wide range of different kinds of meetings that most of us are familiar with. And then, as John mentioned, you can send in questions or chat or raise your hand, and we'll have a discussion about meeting modality and how that impacts our community. And we do have an exit survey for the end of our program or webinar. I feel blessed or happy to learn from our panelists today. We have 3 panelists spanning different types of professional conferences that are very valuable to our community and conferences that we all benefit from. Traman Basden. Traman works with the Association of Black Geoscientists. They just completed their meeting. He also works for Shell. We know that meeting directly benefits many students in our community and makes a tremendous difference in their lives. Megan Plinge. Megan, you're gonna have to help me. Plinge. Thank you. So Megan works at UNC Chapel Hill, and Megan was an organizer for last summer's Earth Educators Rendezvous. And so she can provide perspective on that meeting. Rebecca Fazzari works for GSA, and we're upcoming national meeting in Denver. The next regional meeting for North Central is here at Grand Valley State in Michigan. So GSA does a tremendous amount of organizing and conferences for our group and our society. So welcome to the panelists. In a minute, we'll have you tell us about your organizations. So the broadest terms here, thinking about the chat, if you want to start submitting questions shortly after our speakers introduce themselves, what are the obstacles that you face in participating in these meetings? Keep in mind that we'll go to the Q&A. We have the code of conduct. We've talked about that, and you can raise your hands as you move forward. So I think I'd like to back up to here, and Traman, can you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the conferences that you've been running?
Sure. First, let me thank you guys, NAGT, for inviting me to this panel. Very happy to be here. I know you guys have been a tremendous supporter of NABG over the last few years, if not longer. So really happy to be here today. As Stephen said, my name is Traman Basden. I am currently the president of the National Association of Black Geoscientists, and we actually last week just completed our first ever hybrid conference. So of course, similar to everyone else, I guess 2020 and 2021, we handled our fall conference via Zoom. It was definitely a bit of a learning curve to kind of understand how we could best facilitate the meeting and still provide an impactful experience to both students and professionals. But over the last 2 years, I think we got really good at putting on virtual events. However, when we started planning for this year's conference, there were definitely some changes in the overall landscape of COVID and also people's attitudes towards the pandemic. So I guess on our side, we definitely had a little bit of Zoom fatigue, and we were really excited to try to get back in person. When we started planning was before Omicron was a thing. So it was a little bit more of a, I guess, comfortable situation for us in terms of attempting to bring together a group of 100, 150 people. Funny enough, we thought that given, still that there's a pandemic going on, that we have a good amount of folks who would probably not want to attend the conference in person, but we actually ended up having more people register for in person than we've ever had before. So about 150 people ended up coming to the conference. But kind of back to how we made the decision to go with the hybrid event, was just thinking about the overall impact that we wanted to have and also not making, I guess, make an environment where people were uncomfortable with coming, and having them kind of completely left out. So we put our heads together and came up with the COVID protocol for the meeting first. And so we required mass vaccination, and basically a 24-hour attestation before attending the conference, that, you hadn't been around anyone who was infected and that you had a negative test. We also kind of during the brainstorming period figured that would probably, I guess, have some people decide that they'd rather not attend in person. And therefore we definitely wanted to have some kind of virtual component to the conference. Given that we had done Zoom the past 2 years, we felt pretty confident with our abilities to handle both a in-person and virtual conference at the same time. There were definitely some hurdles that we had to cross in terms of understanding what kind of AV support we would need for the meeting, incurring additional costs through a Zoom license, as well as equipment so that we could actually broadcast the meeting. But eventually came up with something that kind of worked well for the AV company and also met our needs for the event. At the end of the day, we had a really successful conference. I'm sure there'll be some questions later, so I won't dive into too many details. But overall, I would say it was very successful. In terms of the planning, things went pretty smoothly, and the execution went really smooth as well. So yeah, just happy that we were able to impact so many people through both the in-person and the virtual component of the meeting this year.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. And I already have a couple questions, but that's okay. Megan, would you like to go next?
Sure, I'm happy to do so. I'm Megan Plinge. I acted as the program co-chair for the Earth Educator Rendezvous Conference last year. And I was on the planning committee the year before that. And so I got to see kind of the inner workings of figuring out what we were going to do for our annual conference, both in a completely online year and in a completely in-person year. We did go back and forth a lot about this summer's conference being completely in person. So we did not have a hybrid component to it. Although I'm going to caveat that by saying that some of the workshop leaders decided to do their own Zoom component to allow for some people who ended up getting COVID at the last minute and not being able to attend the conference to still be able to participate. So officially it was an in-person only conference, but we did have some allowances made for people who were already registered to come and were not able to do so at the workshop leader's discretion. In our conversations about this, we talked about the Earth Educator Rendezvous as being kind of a community-driven event where people, it's a relatively small conference that usually has around 300 people. The registration was actually a little bit larger when we were completely online, I think because more people were able to attend, not having to incur travel costs, et cetera. But because it's relatively small, we found it to be a really strong community building event for people who are interested in geoscience education. And we wanted to regain some of that community component. So we got feedback from a lot of people that an all-day conference, which is both contributed program and workshops, was really strenuous mentally to be on Zoom all day long the year that we had it on Zoom, and then also try to participate in events that were supposed to be more community building events. And so, you know, we had a lot of people who were like, I just couldn't participate in as much stuff as I could in an in-person conference, and they felt strongly about being back in person. And I do think that being back in person this last year was amazing in terms of community building, in terms of the types of connections that we saw being made, and all of these things that we, you know, so missed during the years that we were unable to be around other people. But we thought about incorporating a larger hybrid component, and really worried about budgets and how we could make that work in terms of the technical support that we had. And so we decided to go fully in person, knowing that there were a lot of online resources that weren't all day long workshops that people could do, such as the webinar that we're doing right now. So we had talked about trying to balance out the types of material that we were presenting to the geoscience education community in one giant lump in this in-person conference, and trying to balance that with the materials that would be available for people who were unable to attend or uncomfortable being in a large group setting during COVID. So I'm sure people have lots of questions for me, and I'm sorry some of that didn't come out quite as smoothly as I wanted it to.
Megan, thank you. No, still very insightful, good information. Rebecca, tell us a GSA perspective.
Sure. So first, thank you all for having me today. My name is Rebecca Fazzari. I'm the Director of Meetings and Events with the Geological Society of America. And I joined GSA in 2019. So I got to have one in-person meeting before this whole world changed and went upside down on its head. In 2020, like many, we actually were able to convert our annual meeting, which was supposed to be in Montreal, to be 100% online. And like many have mentioned, there was definitely a lot of learning curves with all the different technologies that was out there. A lot of new vendors came out trying to sell their wares and weren't really set up to handle the size and scope of our meeting. And unfortunately, we had to cancel all of our local regional meetings that year just because it was too close in the spring to move those around. In 2021, we were able to host all of our regional meetings that happened in the spring online. And we worked with a platform, and we still work with a platform called Conference Exchange, and they're our platform we use for submittal of proposals and abstracts. And then they have a web-based mobile app, and also a native mobile app. So we ran all of our section meetings through that, and found that to be pretty successful, at least from the engagement of getting out the science to attendees, and tried a few different things with networking. I think that's been the hardest nut to crack when it comes to this virtual world, is the networking component just isn't the same as it is in person. That and the exhibitor sponsorship ROI is just not the same. But we tried a couple different things to give people that opportunity to talk to each other. But like most of you mentioned, like Zoom fatigue and burnout is real. And after being on a computer listening to sessions, you were done, and you didn't. It was really hard to like have a glass of wine or a beer via the computer with a colleague versus in person. So then we were successful in the fall of 21 hosting a hybrid meeting in Portland, Oregon. We had about 3,000 people in attendance, which is much lower than GSA's normal meeting of 5,000 to 7,000. And then we had 1,000 that participated online. And for that meeting, Portland was still requiring masks, actually indoors and outdoors. So it made us having that policy really seamless. We required folks to be vaccinated and upload a proof of vaccination, and we worked with a third-party vendor for that. We did daily health screenings. We invested in having electromagnetic static cleaning done in between the session rooms, between the morning break and afternoon break. You know, the social distancing, the spacing, all the things. We did all of that in 2021, and was very happy at the end of the day to have those both in person and online participating. We didn't offer the whole program. We offered over 50%, but not the full meeting program. And then after that, we looked at how we wanted to move forward for Denver, which is coming up in 3 weeks for me. And we and our leadership really decided they wanted to open up the whole program to be as inclusive and accessible as possible. So we are now going to be streaming the whole meeting to attendees, all of the technical sessions, along with all of our keynotes and So we're in that process now of gearing up for that, which is a lot from a staff management side, from the technical equipment needed to do that, the AV, the cost of the internet at the convention center, captioning, trying to have some of the sessions be live captioned. Others are going to just rely on the computer generated captioning that Zoom provides, which we probably all have seen is not always the best at geological terms. Also medical terms, it definitely struggles. But that's kind of where we are right now with what we can do, and we'll see how that goes. And then we'll see what we're doing for Pittsburgh in 23.
Wow. Rebecca, thank you. Sounds like monumental challenges. And Mike, just a quick question. Rebecca, what's your background?
Sure. So initially I was a software analyst system engineer at a college for Verizon Communications, and then moved into the hospitality industry in 2004. So I've been doing hospitality meetings and events since then, and just kind of kept learning with the curve of things changing and growing. And when COVID hit, it was getting up to speed as quickly as we all could on the different technology and platforms. And so having a technology background helped a little bit on that.
I think it would. It's usually us geologists trying to figure out how to make things work and contacting external providers. So your group Conference Exchange sounds like they're really working out well. So that sounds good. Trauma, I had a question for you. You have a sense of how many people were face-to-face and how many were online. Can you give us some idea how many decided to stay home and be online?
Yeah, so we had a total of about 220 registrants, with about 150 being in person and roughly 70 in person. I think we had maybe like 5 to 7 people at the last minute after testing that weren't able to attend in person. So those folks attended virtually as well. I was actually doing a ton of running around during the meeting, so I couldn't monitor the actual online component as much as I would have liked to, but I think the peak participation that I saw at any given time was about 30 or 40 individuals. So I think to be expected, right? When you've got people who register virtually, they'll kind of jump in and out as they're available. But overall, one of the highest attended conferences that we've hosted.
And in the future, do you plan to stay hybrid?
Good question. We haven't discussed future events yet. I think that given the overall impact that we're able to make, I mean, we've had, at this past conference, we had 2 students one from Nigeria and the other from Uganda to present their work at our conference, which is something that, otherwise wouldn't have been possible. So it definitely opens a lot of doors for people who might have some kind of burdens to travel to be able to participate. So I think that's something that we'll discuss. But yeah, I think it's definitely overall a positive for an organization of our size, and it's quite manageable for us.
Thank you. It was interesting. All of you mentioned a little bit about community building and different perspectives. Laura, was somebody else had maybe something from the chat?
Yeah, there's a question in the chat that I thought the panelists could address that comes from Mimi Furman, and she noted that many of the panelists mentioned this challenge, which I think is where you were going, Steve. So sorry to interrupt you, about community building, the social component and networking, particularly in the online and hybrid environment, and whether there are any lessons learned or best practices that folks came away with from the conferences that they ran in either dual modality or just online, that they might want to share with the group today. That's for any panelist.
I think a lot of it really just comes down to how active the participants online want to be. I mean, I know for myself, when I've attended conferences, even pre the pandemic, where it was digital, where I was participating digitally or virtually, it's hard to balance that commitment of going on a session or going in, and then at the same time, there's your work right there on the other screen, emails popping up. Like, whereas when you're in person, it's easier to kind of shut that down. Some of the things I've seen events do that I think is just, it's simple and easy, but it does get people connected when they're on this kind of environment, is if you're the leader of the webinar or whatever, starting out the conversation in the chat of, hey, where are you coming to from today? You know, and just so people then put in the chat, I'm coming from Denver, I'm from Michigan, I'm from, you know, and then all it's like, oh, wow, wait, I might run into you sometime in person because you live in the same area I live in. Just something simple like that to connect people. I've seen work really well, but I think a lot of it just goes back to how much can people invest in the time to shut down if they're at home versus in person.
Mhm.
Thank you for that.
So here's what we've done over the past few years. So when we were fully virtual, we kind of just tried some things. So usually at the conferences, we have exhibitors from university partners, industry, national labs, et cetera. And so what we did to kind of give them an opportunity to still interact with the students on like a one-on-one basis. Well, first we did an exhibitor showcase, so gave everybody a chance to kind of give a 30-second, 1-minute blurb about who they are and what they have to offer the students. And we also had them set up their own individual kind of like breakout rooms, so that if folks wanted to pop in and speak to a recruiter, they were able to do that. We also had some individual rooms that we set up for coffee chats for the same purposes there. I guess that worked out pretty well when we were fully virtual. I think folks still had an opportunity to have some of those more serendipitous interactions, even through the computer screen. This past conference, we didn't put as much effort in the virtual component as we did in previous years, just because there's already so much to plan for the in-person part. So the most that we were able to kind of have more interaction for the folks who participated virtually was during one of our workshops. We actually had groups break out in person, and we also moved the virtual participants in a breakout room so they could have those smaller group discussions. And then once we all came back together, had a representative from the online groups to kind of give a summary of what they had discussed. So things like that, I think, make for more of that kind of informal interaction that you will get at the actual conference, but it's still just not the same.
Megan, I see your hand up.
So I wanted to share, when we were fully online for EER in 2021, we had one of our evening social events using, I don't know, a software, a website, whatever you want to say, called Remo, R-E-M-O. And Remo was kind of cool because it made it so that you could sign in, and it actually showed like an image of a room with tables. And you could actually move from room to room without knowing who was at the table, so that you could start up some of these conversations. Now, I'll say it was really cool, but there was not a huge amount of participation. And in fact, my own participation was limited by the fact that I have children and I live on the East Coast. And in order to accommodate people who live on the West Coast, basically this social event was happening like during my children's bedtime, right? And I'm here at the house and I hear them screaming. And, you know, so again, this comes back to some of the points that were already made about how difficult it is to keep people engaged for 8 hours or for more than 8 hours if you really want them to engage in as much of the conference as possible. Going to a point that Trayman was making, I think that during the actual workshops is where people had most of the social interactions, because you could break out into rooms and have discussions that feel a little bit more like these relaxed, like networking kind of, oh, you do this, so do I kind of discussions. And again, we did not go hybrid this year, so I don't have, you know, data on how it worked for one group versus the other this year. But I heard a lot of people, you know, meeting, going to restaurants together for lunch at our conference, or just like meeting up in the hallways and establishing these new relationships. And I really felt like that is one of the main strengths of being back in person.
Thank you. Lisa sent in a question, and she asked to Trayman and Rebecca, are there key differences in the feedback that you got from the in-person and Zoom participants about the experience of the hybrid conference?
Yeah, not to sound like a record player, but the biggest thing that we get back is just that lack of in-person kind of community building, relationship forming that you get in person. Like I said, we kind of tried our best during our virtual events, our fully virtual events, to create an atmosphere where that was possible. And I can even say for myself, from participating in other conferences, and I'm a pretty outgoing person, don't have a problem walking up to people. It's just a little awkward when you're online and you're in the little room and you're waiting for somebody else to pop up, and it's just like, hello, person on the computer screen. So yeah, just not being able to build community as you would in person.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think we got some positive response, was especially for those who couldn't travel or didn't have the funds. They were appreciative of the opportunity for the online, and especially if they could present. But a lot of the same feedback was, a lot of our messaging was all about the in-person, which, because we want to be the can't miss event, we want you to be there in person, but also at the same time, anything that the online attendees were getting, so could the in-person attendees. So there was ways that in-person folks could chat through the Zoom in the room with the online attendees if they chose to. So it's hard to message just one thing to one set of group and not the other, when we are trying to make it seamless for both. And you could be in Portland or Denver, but not want to come to the convention center to listen to the session, and you have the opportunity to log in and listen to it from your hotel room. So that was probably the biggest feedback we got, was they wanted more for the online audience. But when you're limited, kind of as everyone's mentioned, you only have so many staff, and staff is busy dealing with what's going on site at the convention center, and hopefully not putting out too many fires there. It's hard to also then focus on the online audience.
I will say one thing that worked really well for us this year with our hybrid event, AV was superb. So we actually were able to pipe in audio from folks who are online. And so if, after a presentation, there were questions, we could just hop on the mic and say, does anyone online have any questions? And they could come off mute and actually pipe their voice into the room. So it made it feel more like they were actually there than just someone online.
And Trayman, did you guys hire an external provider for that, or was that something that you guys learned how to do?
We sourced everything through the hotel. So we ran through kind of all of the packages that they had for kind of a hybrid conference support, landed on something that was cost effective for us and still got us kind of what we needed for the event. And tech support was basically in and out of the room all day if we needed anything.
Yeah, there was a question in the chat about smooth running. And in general, the conferences I've attended have been smooth running, but occasionally somebody steps in the room and makes a connection. A question, did you do an analysis of introverts and extroverts?
No, we did not. One thing that we did do in kind of all of our marketing materials was try to make it clear that we wanted as many people as possible to attend in person. So things like, while we understand the current event or current state of the pandemic, we really like to see you in Houston, things like that, and making costs not necessarily prohibitive for the virtual side, but maybe make folks think, well, if I have to spend this much money, then I might as well pay to go in person, if they could afford, of course. For the same reason that we've been talking about during the entire webinar here, just the value of being in person is kind of unmatched when you think about that versus a virtual.
Yeah, we didn't do an analysis either, but GSA, prior to the pandemic and even now, in our in-person meeting, our in-person annual meeting, we designate 1 or 2 self-care rooms at the convention center for those folks who are more of introverts or just get overwhelmed or have other conditions where they just need a moment to themselves to go and escape and don't want to go back to their hotel room. So we provide that type of service for someone who maybe does get overstimulated. I know I may not come across as it right now, but I am actually one of those introverts, and I loved the pandemic and not having to go out and socialize and be around people. It was great, especially when they started opening restaurants again and they weren't as crowded and overwhelming. It was very nice. But humans in nature are social beings, and so I think even the most introverted of us wants to get back to some kind of social aspect and be out and talk to people. And then they just manage, their time accordingly with what their own needs are.
Rebecca, can you give us a sense of cost? So it does raise the cost of the meeting.
Yes, it does.
I don't know if you want to tell us how much or if that's very important. But let me just well, the other aspect there is, do you get pushback on that increased cost?
Yes, I do. Probably on a daily basis, from my friends on Twitter, which I am not on Twitter for that reason. Yeah, no, I mean, it adds a lot of cost. And someone asked in there how large of our team. So GSA in general is a team, has an office of 50 employees. My team in the meetings department is only 8, including myself. And then we usually only bring about 30 so staff on site to our meetings. So while we're busy doing all the stuff on site, my team of 8, we have a third-party AV company that we travel with, and they now had to up the number of staff they have to help manage all of the sessions being hybrid and live streams. Before, we could get away with having floating technicians, and all floating technicians means is they're not sitting in the room with you, they're out in the hallway, and if something comes up, they run in. Now I'm paying to have 1 technician per 2 rooms, and I have 23 breakout rooms at the same time, plus a keynote room. And then the platform I mentioned, Conference Exchange, we're doing everything through them, using their Zoom licenses and their web mobile app platform. They're also going to have techs on their side to help those coming in from virtual, and their model is 1 tech per 4 room. So now I'm paying for those techs as well. And then the cost of the internet hardwired line, which you need to make sure you have, is very expensive at the convention centers, and varies greatly. We were in Portland last year, and a hardwired line was only $100 in that per meeting room. And this year it's now costing me $900 per meeting room. So yeah, I love my budget, not really. So, I mean, those are the things you can't control. And then, like, from an accessibility standpoint, we were wanting to do everything be live closed captioning, but when those people cost anywhere from $150 to $200 an hour, and you have 8 hours a day times 23 sessions times 4 days, it wasn't feasible to do something like that. So we're limiting where we're doing that, and the rest of it, praying Google and Zoom likes us for the captioning. Yeah, it's very different than, the gallon of coffee that we're paying for, which even that's gone up. I mean, everything's going up, right? I mean, we all see it at homes. I mean, a gallon of coffee can be $60 at the hotel or $130 at the convention center, or vice versa. And you only get 20 cups of coffee out of a gallon of coffee. So, I mean, things that the attendees don't see, and then they don't understand why the costs are so high and why they keep going up. And I mean, we're a nonprofit, but we still have to cover our expenses, and it's not like we're charging to make millions and millions of dollars. We're just trying to break even.
Yeah, so I mean, given that the scale of our conference is much smaller, we can have much more of an, I guess, intimate setting. So we hosted the last conference at a hotel, and kind of going back and forth with the negotiations, it became evident that they basically been hurting for business. So they were a little bit more flexible with what we could do in terms of our room block, offering free internet, offering meeting rooms for no charge. So we were definitely able to save a bit by going with the venue that we did. In terms of the costs, we had to go back and forth with AV guys like 6 times to get something that worked for us. And basically on top of the AV for the in-person meeting, so speakers, projectors, microphones, we ended up paying maybe like 30 or 40% on top of what we had spent for that, for the virtual component. And this was after kind of limiting it to kind of the bare necessities of what we needed. So a USB interface so that we could broadcast the audio via Zoom, and choosing not to rent video cameras because that would have incurred another hourly fee for the guys to actually run the camcorders. So we basically, for most of the event, given that slides would be shown and the video would be a tiny box on your screen, literally just turned on my laptop camera and tried to position it so we could get as good as a view of the room as possible for the folks who are online. So yeah, we did it in a very cost-effective way, and I think we were still able to achieve what we set out to. In terms of planning for virtual versus in person, we have a committee of about 8 or 9 people that were mostly focused on the in-person component. I was essentially the virtual piece, so I handled all the contracts. I got to the hotel early to make sure that all of the AV was up and running. I did the test calls on Zoom to make sure that folks could hear us online and we could hear them. In the 2 days that we did the virtual and in person, I spent maybe 45 minutes with the AV guys total. So it wasn't a huge burden for someone who's technologically savvy, and even not really. I think it's not a huge burden to overcome in order to be able to do both the in person and the virtual.
There's another question in the chat, and it's Mimi asking whether you did any of the panelists did some sort of analysis on the diversity of participants when you were doing in-person versus virtual versus hybrid meetings?
Well, I can speak to our completely online in 2021 and our completely in person in 2022. Although we had less participants in the fully in-person meeting that we had this last summer, when we looked at the breakdown of participants in terms of where they're coming from. So this may not be the diversity that's being asked about, but our conference caters to K-12 educators, community college instructors, graduate students, geoscience education researchers, and then whoever else in the world of education that might be interested in coming and meeting with people. So sometimes that ends up being people from NASA or people from GSA, people from NOAA, people who want to incorporate more broad educational outreach into their upcoming NSF grants and want to get started somewhere, so it's a diverse group in that regard. And I will say that even though the numbers were different, the actual breakdowns of how many people from each group attended were the same for us between the 2 years.
Yeah, I don't think we've done an analysis to kind of fully understand what the demographics look like for virtual versus in person. But I will say for the 2020 and 2021 conferences, when we were fully virtual, we definitely had a much larger international contingent. So we had people calling in from Germany, Ireland, over the African continent, where normally we just don't get those folks who are participating. So this is folks who might be doing a postdoc overseas somewhere, or even just students that are studying at international universities. So it definitely opened up the opportunity to have more of an international presence.
Yeah, the same for us. In 2020, we saw our international participation go up to 18% versus our normal 10%. But GSA didn't really start asking more demographic questions as part of registration until last year. So it hasn't really, we don't have as much data yet to really look at and determine, is there an impact of who's signing up online versus who's coming in person? I think a lot of it's just coming to, funding, and if they have the money available from their institutions, especially since that was cut from a lot during the pandemic, or can they get grants or travel funds or something like that?
Thank you. It's pretty interesting to see that the international component can grow if we do the virtual aspect. We have a little time left. Participants, you're welcome to unmute and ask a question or raise a hand or drop something into the chat. I like the self-care rooms, Rebecca. I'm going to see if I can get you one of those in GSA North Central.
Yeah, no, we do them at all the annual meetings, and then also trying to work with the centers. If they don't have like a dedicated mother's room, then we create one.
Yeah.
Megan, I have a question for you. In your introduction, one of the things that I think I heard you say was that there was sort of a grassroots effort from some workshop facilitators to include a virtual component, and whether, now that people are interested and possible to do that kind of activity, whether you might consider adding that as an option or part of the rendezvous structure moving forward, like a choice for workshop facilitators to do their workshop entirely face-to-face or potentially in hybrid, and maybe what some of the challenges might be if you foresee them.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that. I'll say that some of these things are not, some of the concerns, I'll say, are not ones that I see directly as a program chair, and it's more the staffing component in terms of the technical side that knows about these challenges. And I just say, what about doing this? And they say, that's feasible or that's not feasible. But going back to the grassroots efforts, there are some of the workshops that are done there that are more conducive to having people participate in a hybrid way than others. So for example, we had a team of researchers who had developed this rotating tanks model for teaching about atmospheric fluid dynamics and oceanic fluid dynamics. And there was really no way to participate in a workshop like that unless you were in person, right? They actually created the tanks and worked with them and all of that in the classroom. There are other ones. So the one that I'm discussing in particular was a universal design workshop, right? And so maybe I'm like, oh, well, that's the perfect workshop to actually have the facilitators be interested in introducing an online component. And I will say there were challenges there because we did not have support staff to help them run the workshop in a hybrid manner. So they were doing their own troubleshooting on the ground. And a lot of it relied on the resources that were already available at the institution where we held the meeting. And so I think that moving forward, I would love for workshop facilitators to decide if they think that their workshop would be a good candidate for doing that. And to talk to the universities that we are going to be having these meetings at to see how well set up the rooms are for a hybrid event, so that we don't have to incur these outside costs that we've heard other people talking about in terms of trying to make this happen, and then go from there. And I think if we did that while maintaining, so the good and the bad is I think we would have to maintain the same registration fees and the same overall structure of the conference that we currently have to do this. And so if someone is willing to still pay the registration fees for the in-person conference, but knew that their person running their workshop was going to provide a way for people to attend remotely, then they could do that. But I don't think we would be able to structure it so you'd have a hybrid or a virtual only sign up registration stream and then another stream for the people who were going to be in person. I think so the answer is yes, I think that that's a great option for the workshop facilitators if they're willing to take on that additional work while we maintain the conference in general in its in-person form.
Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else?
Steve, there's another question in the chat from, I'm sorry if I get this wrong, but Riamat. Can you see that?
So did you get, go ahead, Laura.
I was just going to say it's a question about accessibility and some of the arguments or strategies that you might have used to try and increase accessibility of your conferences.
I can speak more broadly on inclusivity in terms of why we decided to even do hybrid. So, of course, for various reasons, people have various feelings about vaccination and how they are moving about the world through the pandemic. And so we wanted to make sure that we had an avenue for those folks who didn't feel comfortable coming or didn't agree with the COVID protocol, that they still had the opportunity to attend. It was pretty much a unanimous decision from the committee. There were some folks who were actually still more on the cautious side that wanted us to do fully virtual. But in the end of the decision was to do the hybrid meeting so that we didn't alienate anyone for any reasons related to the pandemic, and make sure that they had the opportunity to attend and experience as much as the conference as possible as someone who did in person.
Yeah, and for us, we didn't have any like backlash per se about going this direction. It was actually part of GSA's decadal strategic plan prior to the pandemic to start offering more virtual components of our, whether it be our meeting or doing virtual field trips. So the pandemic just pushed that plan on speed dial and fast forwarded it a lot, but it was always something GSA had been looking to do. And so now it's just a matter of finding the right model that works. And so we did half hybrid last year. We're doing full hybrid this year. Next year will be, we only, have an in-person meeting, and then a few weeks later we do an only virtual component for those who don't want to come and present their science in Pittsburgh. So that way, it's two opportunities, but not overlapping. I don't know. It's everyone seems to be trying to figure out what fits best for their members out there. And again, make it as accessible and inclusive as possible, which is a challenge, which, with, different needs people have, whether it's, translation of languages or, sign language or closed captioning, or I attended a webinar recently where to be truly accessible for just different disabilities, she read every slide. So when a slide came up, she would say, we've changed the slide, and on this slide is this picture, and this is the text on this slide. And it was very fascinating to hear like the extent of what, if you truly are going to be doing something that's accessible for all, that you have to do. And so.
And I'll go ahead and add to that a little bit. Again, from the EER point of view, as we discussed this, and everyone knew that the more inclusive route was to have these virtual options. And we wanted to balance that knowledge with what we wanted to generate in this conference experience, and knowing about the challenges that people have in continuous online engagement. We decided to think of these as like two separate kind of channels for producing these workshop materials and for creating these engagement opportunities. And so again, it just seemed to us that having the conference as fully in person, but having complementary and additional online webinars and online experiences that people could have to get at some of the same ideas that would come out at the workshops at EER was the best route. So, again, for us, it wasn't really about pushback. It wasn't like people were like, no, this is, like hybrid's a terrible idea, we don't want to be inclusive. We just were like, well, it seems like a goal for this conference would be one thing, and then the goal for including these people who want the materials but maybe can't actually go in person or are uncomfortable going in person would still be able to get a lot of the same resources and a lot of the same information using these other avenues.
Great. I see that John's come back to join us, so he's probably prompting me. I'd very much like to thank our panelists. We're very fortunate to have you. You provided great insights from your three different really important and different kinds of meetings that serve our community. So thank you for giving up part of your day. I want to thank John for making the webinars run smoothly, and also Bradley Cotton also helps coordinate webinars for us, and that runs really smoothly. I also appreciate the help of my DEI committee members. John, back to you.
So I know that you wanted to, we're getting close to the end, but I know you wanted to have a couple of exit survey questions here just quickly. So I'm going to open up a quiz for folks to just respond very quickly, and then we'll try to move on to the second one if we get a good response in just a couple seconds. So if you could just respond, how many Earth Educators Rendezvous meetings have you attended? got a nice mix of people. Lots of folks have only been to 1 or 2 or even 0. So that's so you should definitely check those out. They're pretty cool. So I'm gonna close this one, and I want to do one more question here. Just in terms of if you do, or if you're thinking about going to the Earth Educators Rendezvous, is it your first choice, or is it further down the list, or is it just not something that you're thinking about doing? Great. This is really helpful information. I don't think we have time to get to that third question, Steve, but I will be sending out a workshop, a webinar evaluation, and I can maybe tack that one on to the webinar evaluation when it goes out, so that we do get some of that additional information for you guys. Does that sound good?
It does. Thank you, John.
Great.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.